Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good day to you all. This is a session of our Friends of Multilateralism Group, and I'm Shen Kunlu. I'm the CEO and founder of this group. I won't talk anything about the subject today. I'll leave that to the more capable hands of Tatjana, Jayashree, our two members, and also the three ambassadors. But I just have a few kind of management and logistic things to announce. The first thing to say is that FMG just changed our board. So we have three board members who have served 2 terms with us. So Alejandro, Patrick, and Stuart, they have left the board, but they're still active members. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank them for really great contribution, but also the great leadership in getting FMG where we are now in the past more than 4-6 years. And they have been really leading this group. And actually today's meeting, I understand, is the result, the fruit of a discussion between Stuart and Tatjana. So we have a new board now, and I think our all board members, most of us are here, and also especially our chair and deputy chair of the board. So it's Mia as the chair and Mario Massus as the deputy chair. So I just want to welcome the new board members and then look forward to working with them in the future. The third thing, as Natalie was explaining before the meeting, is that this is first time FMG is doing a webinar, so opening the session more than just to traditionally invitees, ambassadors, and other stakeholders, but also to the public. So we do have quite a list of registered interested people joining us today. So I want to welcome them also. I think they can post their questions in the chat, and then Natalia and Lelani will try to pick out the relevant questions and trying to send to Tatjana so she could raise this during the Q&A with the panelists. So I'll just stop here and give the floor to Tatjana and the panel. Thank you, Tatjana, please.
Thank you very much, Lou. Can you all hear us? Perfect. No, thank you very much and welcome to our session on connecting the dots on trade. Now, having negotiating silos is really not a new phenomenon, but there seems to have been an increasing number of instances where negotiations take place outside the WTO that touch increasingly on trade issues. That covers a very broad range of issues, from the environment to climate change, to IP and labor. Now, while of course the outcomes of negotiations in those fora often influence each other, the negotiators that negotiate particular agreements or treaties in other fora are not necessarily as familiar with trade issues. And I give you one example. It's the ongoing negotiations of the pandemic agreement, which are currently taking place at the World Health Organization. And those negotiations touch upon a broad range of trade issues, from an entire chapter on supply chains and supply chain resilience to TRIPS waiver and also export restrictions. Now, we have an absolutely stellar panel here today, and we will explore some of the issues, deep dive into some of the negotiations that are taking place in those other international fora. And then we would also like to brainstorm on how we can better connect the dots on trade. What are some of the recommendations of our panelists? I will, of course, introduce the panelists by name, but I would like to allow for more time to brainstorm and for discussion. So I will not read out their bios, but you have all received, of course, their bios in advance of this meeting. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Ambassador Guilherme Patriota, who will set the scene and provide his intervention now. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tatjana, for inviting me, and in the company of such renowned colleagues. I hope I don't say anything extremely obvious. So I'm very intimidated, but I'll try to make a contribution. I think, well, I'm a long-serving sort of multilateralist, if you will, from Brazil. So I really believe in multilateralism. That's my preferred type of diplomacy. I've been doing this since I entered the Foreign Service in the 80s. And also my father was in the same business. So I have a bit of a longer perspective. It predates my own, let's say, beginnings in the career. And my perspective on the system, he also served in Geneva. He also worked at WIPO, WTO, the GATT at the time. And so I've been hearing things even before I myself started working. And to me, there's a sort of a growth in the international multilateral system, including the trade system, since post-World War, that was kind of going in a certain direction. It was kind of Western-led in trade in particular. A lot of the rules we have today, in my view, were sort of coming or building upon a lot of it from a kind of a US sort of type of domestic legislation that was exported to the world. So it was a bit the victors of the Second World War were kind of building the international water to their own, in their own fashion, of course, also in their own interest. And in this process that was sort of linear in a way, you know, all the sequencing of several GATT rounds, and then we finally managed to get the World Trade Organization in place with the Marrakesh Agreement finally after many years of Uruguay round, which I think was the most ambitious and comprehensive of all rounds, perhaps the last such round. And this was going in a certain direction. It was deepening the integration of corporations that were going completely global, and there was, I think, an enthusiasm with globalization up to a point where even the negative consequences of globalization started to be mitigated by putting a human face to it, but we still moved on. And all of the rules we had were in that direction. I think the world now all of a sudden is changing. There was an excessive belief that the mere liberalization of trade finance and everything else would make the world look like the West as a whole. But it didn't. All of a sudden, we started to put other big actors inside the system. They were not there before, so now they are. China in particular entered in 2001. Then we had Russia accession and many others now. WTO now has 166 members. Things began to get more complicated. Also, I must say that the system was built perhaps more around manufacturing, industrial production, goods. This also started to change with time. So the rules became more complex and encompassed other types of economic activities beyond industrial production and manufacturing. And so we went beyond the tariff issues, the barriers on material goods, you know, traveling the world to encompass services. And then we took a big jump. We have Jayashree here with us, who's an expert on this. So we incorporated the whole world of IP into the WTO system. It was a world apart. It predated actually the WTO. And it was quite big in and of itself and complex, but it was also different in nature. It was flexible. Countries could have different types of legislations. They could adhere to treaties in different speed, at different speed, and accept different types of obligations. Whereas once all this entered WTO after the Uruguay round, it was a kind of a standard harmonized obligations for all and tied to the dispute settlement system. So there was an enforcement attached to it that gave it a lot of clout. And that became sort of the center of the world. I don't know what happened. Well, what happened later on is that the agenda, I think, outgrew itself, became very complex. There's also agriculture, a big issue for Brazil. We managed to get an agreement at the time of the Uruguay round. It was seen as the possible agreement, but not necessarily as deep as it should have been. So for many ag exporting countries, the agricultural agreement was seen as a trade-off, but not a great one, in exchange for accepting other things like the TRIPS agreements on technology, which we didn't have, produce, or export. So it was seen as a lopsided outcome. In any case, the agenda, as you can see, grew. No longer just goods. We started to have services. We started to have technology because of IP and all the related rules and disciplines on that. We started to include investments because the TRIMS agreement is a kind of a small agreement, but it's an extremely effective one in terms of restricting what countries can do, the policy space of members to implement certain types of industrial policies that rely on local content or export performance and all that menu of options. Actually, this menu of options is coming back today with a vengeance, but in those times, the belief was they were bad for everyone. So the world was a single market and globalization was going great. But now, all of a sudden, the belief that this would lead also to a kind of a liberal type of countries, of governments, that it would make everybody look like the West did not happen. And some big members entered the system. They work within the system, they formally comply with the system, but they have learned to use the system to their own benefits, and they didn't necessarily change the way it was expected through time. So now we have competitors, and this is perceived by some other countries as a bit of a threat to the international order, or at least to the hierarchy within it. It's a disruption. There's a possibility of other members becoming just as powerful as the former powerful states that built the system. So I think there's an exhaustion in terms of how much more the system can open up the international economy on a harmonized level. There's an overriding concern now about the impact of all this, of all that we have built in terms of relative progress and development of countries, with certain members becoming possibly more powerful than the original leaders. So this is a big issue that makes geopolitics become a greater concern than just the mere idea of freeing up world trade. And so that's a new order of considerations. I think there's even a bit of an exhaustion of how much more free trade the leaders are willing to have. So there's a return to national inward-looking economic and industrial policies in the leading countries that have built the system, so they no longer see the system the same way. There's been a change of hearts. There's been new entrants that became very powerful and are challenging the old ones. And we're now in a situation where things are completely bogged down. Agreements are harder to get. And just a little bit of comment on the introduction by Tatjana. Not that I disagree with you, but as you were speaking, my own experience was saying a little bit of the opposite. I think the world trade hasn't managed to produce new norms that are specifically the pure trade norms that it deals with. So there's a lot of extra trade issues permeating the WTO that WTO negotiators actually are not very familiar with. So it's a bit the other way around. It's not just people addressing trade outside of WTO that don't know trade. I think now the WTO can't do trade. So they're kind of expanding the agenda towards non-trade concerns or other kinds of trade-related concerns, if everything relates to trade. And it's been also difficult. I could speak for hours on this, but I would just say that there's a lot of articles now, like the world has abandoned the WTO, some very negative kind of assessments of what's going on. I'm a true believer. I think it's still possible to not save the system. So that's my main final message. What do we do? Some people perhaps think of nostalgically of going back, getting the WTO back on track, the way it used to be. The Uruguay round type negotiation. I think that's no longer possible. So in my mind, and you shouldn't shut down the system either, because the system is still extremely important. All our laws, everything we have domestically is mirrored on the WTO agreement. So it is still the kind of standard worldwide. And we have brought countries into that standard. So I think there's a huge benefit there. We shouldn't break down the edifice. what's the future like? I think the future we should frite en avance. That would be my recommendation. We should go forward and be bold. And of course, we have to wait a little bit to see how the world will evolve with the new elections in place. But it's possible, perhaps, to factor into the WTO additional types of considerations. So I think just the pure trade logic doesn't work anymore. So you have to factor in sustainability questions, and you have to factor in also some very important social issues. That has been hard to do in the past. Perhaps now it's not as hard because we have this commonality of view on sustainable development and the 3 dimensions of it, which includes the economic development, the environmental question, and also the social inclusion aspects. So everyone is worried about their middle classes, what to do with the former factory workers now that we're going towards a service-based economy, and now we're going to go into the digital-based economy, and we have until artificial intelligence and all that to deal with. So I think we have to find a way to factor all those new trends into the WTO. It's not an easy thing. We are going to have to break some deadlocks and bring in the developing world, because the developing world is also a little bit mistrustful of the system. They see the system in the past as not having been ideal for them. They see the big players now moving away from the system in many ways. And they also wish somehow to move away from it. So I think we have to rethink the system, but not do away with it. That would be my final. Thank you.
Well, that was incredibly helpful and enlightening. Thank you so much. And I completely agree with you that, of course, connecting the dots on trade is absolutely a two-way street. It's not just looking at other international fora that address trade issues, but also what can the WTO do to address some of the global challenges that impact us all, whether it's from food security or the environment. I'd like to go into that maybe during the second round, because I'd be interested to hear your views and everyone's views on this. And you also very helpfully noted that, of course, the world trading system has gone from focusing largely on manufacturing to newer issues, whether it's services, whether it's investment or intellectual property. And Jayashree, could you tell us maybe a bit more of how intellectual property IP has popped up in international fora, whether it's climate change or other fora that you're familiar with? The floor is yours, Jayashree.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tatjana. I'm really honored to be here in such such high-level company. So it's really nice of you and Stuart to think about me as a panelist for this. So yes, I do have many years in a very narrow field, which is intellectual property. As my daughter says, that's the only thing I know. So when I first began working in this area of intellectual property, 1989, 35 years back, I was then in the government of India, representing India in the TRIPS negotiations. But at that time, the only international forum, which was primarily, the only serious international forum discussing IP matters was the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is the UN Specialized Agency for Intellectual Property, and India was brought kicking and screaming into the Uruguay round negotiations on TRIPS. We fought, of course, a losing battle to prevent TRIPS from going beyond trade in counterfeit goods, which is what India believed was the only trade-related aspect of intellectual property. And at best, intellectual property and competition type issues. But of course, that viewpoint did not gain ground. We used to actually take advice at that time from UNCTAD. UNCTAD is like the think tank for the developing world. And at that time, there was a renowned international law expert, Abdi Yusuf, a Somalian national, who went on to become a judge in the International Court of Justice. He was an international law expert, and he was learning intellectual property law on the job, but he was the one advising us. And as India's representative in the TRIPS negotiations in that crucial year, 1990, when much of the text was developed, I think, in my view, we managed to get a fairly balanced agreement. If you look at it retrospectively, because now we know what's going on with the TRIPS Plus provisions and the FTAs and so on. So in 1995, a new forum was added to WIPO, which is the WTO, and dealing with, as Guilherme said, the most comprehensive agreement on intellectual property, setting norms on IP matters, and everyone thought that's the end of the World Intellectual Property Organization. Everything is now going to move to WTO, and that's going to be the major forum for IP, future IP norms. It didn't happen like that. New norms were created right from the day, WTO came in. There were new treaties which were concluded by 1996 in WIPO dealing with the internet, because TRIPS never really dealt with the internet. But since 1995, there's been an explosion of forums dealing with intellectual property. First, the World Health Organization started with resolutions in as early as 1996, saying that trade issues are going to impinge on health. And from 1996 onwards, almost every year in the World Health Assembly, there were resolutions linking trade and health, and indirectly talking about intellectual property. By the time Doha Declaration happened in 2001, these issues had become not just very, very central in the World Health Organization, but also in the UN Human Rights Council. And then, of course, we had the UNCTAD, occasionally the ITU talking about IP and standards, but this is just Geneva. Then you had UN in New York, UNEP, that is UN Environmental Program, the Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal, the UN FCCC, which is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNDP in New York, all of these with headquarters outside Geneva, which were talking seriously about IP issues. Negotiators were struggling to cope with all these issues in so many different forums, because IP, I think, is kind of an esoteric subject, not something that everybody reads about, at bedtime. So it's kind of difficult. Yeah, maybe to sleep easy. And you see that now. When I take Guilherme's point about that trade negotiators need to learn about non-trade concerns, and those are also important, and there are nuances and there are difficulties in understanding those issues also. But I think negotiators struggle a lot with intellectual property issues. They are not familiar with the nuances and the details of the TRIPS agreement, and sometimes they make proposals that kind of don't make sense to an expert like me, but they are guided a lot by, I want to put this in a nice way, well-meaning NGOs who have their own agendas, and they want to link all these issues. Now, I can see from a negotiating tactic point of view how raising the same issues in different forums can kind of form a pincer-like movement where you're kind of, getting little victories in different forums, and eventually you want to get a victory in the forum that matters, perhaps the World Trade Organization, perhaps. And I can see how successful it was. Brazil leading at that time in the year 2001, when the negotiations on the Doha Agreement on trade, that is TRIPS and public health, came in. So you have the Human Rights Council heavily kind of backing such an agreement. You had the World Health Organization and all of that. And then you had public opinion kind of building up. And that was one of the big reasons for the success. There was also the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and there was a real issue there. Patents were an obstacle at that point. There was a real story behind it. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why it succeeded. Now, I'm not sure that there is real value in expending political capital you know, to get what would eventually be ambiguous provisions in the WHO pandemic agreement, for example, you're not going to get a very clear provision. It's going to necessarily be ambiguous. We all know that as negotiators. So is it worth spending political capital to say that let's support a TRIPS waiver in the WHO pandemic agreement when you know that eventually in a future pandemic, you have to come back to the WTO? It's not going to happen, you know, on its own, just because there is something in World Health Organization's pandemic agreement. So we need to think about all of this. Now, in my view, crucial differences between the credibility of the HIV/AIDS pandemic issues, which led to the successful Doha Declaration negotiations, and the unsuccessful, in my view, COVID-19 TRIPS waiver on COVID-19 vaccines. I don't want to go into a lot of detail here. I'll just end with one thing. Delegates primarily dealing with issues related to health, environment, human rights, development, etc. As I said, they're not familiar with all the nuances of TRIPS. Yet they will and they do need to lead to delve into these issues and make some proposals, you know, which are credible and which they understand and which they can defend on their own without the presence of the NGOs in the room, for example. So how do we deal with that? And I will come back to that in my 3 takeaways. Thank you. Thank you, Tatjana.
Thank you so much, Jayashree. That has also taken me down memory lane. It was fascinating how the different fora that I wasn't even aware of were involved with IP issue at the time, whether it's human rights or other international fora. I'll hand over the floor to Simon. I know we had a brief chat about whether there's also other issues that touch upon trade, but you're completely free to either comment on what was said or pick a topic that's of the most interest to you. I know yesterday we spoke about consumer preferences labor, but the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you for including me in your stellar cast. And I don't have, again, this kind of multi-generational sort of experience of all this, but we just endeavour to kind of offer a few thoughts based on my kind of 3 years here. But I think Guilherme is right to kind of start by saying that the context has changed over recent years, and that's that's true in the WTO. It's obviously true kind of more globally as well. I mean, within the scope of the WTO, there clearly has been a lot of faith in a number of members about the ability of free and open trade to generate prosperity and growth, or at least the right type of growth, really like those terms. And that's that. I think I am with Guilherme. I am both a true believer myself, but also an ambassador of a nation. I think it remains a true believer. It's remarkable, I think, from the UK how bipartisan the consensus remains around free and open trade. And there's clearly been a lot of momentum behind at least the sort of the multilateral, if not the plurilateral aspects of the WTO's work. And that, as Guilherme said, is also reflects a sort of the shift in the global economy. It's the shift towards services, digitalization of the global economy, all of which, by the way, also, I think, offers opportunities for the WTO as well as challenges. And I suppose on the others, I also kind of come at this, I think, from a more positive perspective, because I think, perhaps when you look back, I mean, we all kind of be guilty of looking back with a bit of sort of looking back at the golden age. Golden age, kind of whether it be GATT or the early years of WTO, when obviously there was certainly more multilateral progress, but and where the issues were narrower, where the membership was narrower, where the discussion was narrower. And I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing that the discussion is wider, even if I think we'll be right to say that feeds off to some extent the difficulties of advancing on some of those traditional core issues, whether that be agriculture or goods liberalisation. So when you look at, for me, at these sort of issues of the global commons, as Dr. Nguyen sometimes refers to them, around the environment and climate, around gender, around health. I mean, I think it's right and proper that we have a debate here in Geneva that encompasses the trade aspects of those. If you look, I think I was our Director General back in our foreign ministry during the COVID pandemic, and probably the single biggest obstacle that we were facing to ensuring that the British people were protected against the virus as well as we could were trade restrictions, right? That's what was stymieing our efforts to develop and then share the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine globally. It wasn't a kind of lack of IP. It wasn't a lack of innovation. It was the trade restrictions, which first of all were hampering our supply chains, and then of which sort of undercut our effort to use that vaccine through COVAX globally. So I think it's right that we have that as we're looking at how we best prepare for the next pandemic, and there will be another pandemic. We'll bet on that. I think it's right that we look at that. That we look at the trade aspects of that, as we've sought to do with the WHO and the WTO. It's obviously important, when I come back to this, that we do that in a way that respects the competencies, if you like, of the different organisations. But I think a holistic discussion is good. I think the same is true around nature and climate, and the nature and climate emergency that we're facing. And to be honest, we had not many of these discussions in WTO. Fact is that the measures that we are all trying to take nationally can and often do have a trade impact, right? As we are seeing with CBAMs, deforestation measures. In the UK, we're trying. I'm not sure we're going to succeed. We're trying to work out how we take those measures in ways that don't distort WTO rules and that do actually provide opportunities for developing countries as much as obstacles. But I do think it's right that the WTO has a discussion. I think actually it needs to have a deeper and broader discussion about the positive angle on that and how you actually use trade policy in innovative ways to enable the transition to net zero. How you can use trade policy to spread green tech globally, so that developing countries are better able to seize the opportunities, which undoubtedly are there, not least because of the sort of the abundance of sustainable energy resources in the developing world, to use those opportunities more effectively to trade in green goods and services. And lastly, so I'm a co-chair of the formal working group in WTO on trade and gender, which remarkably remains a slightly controversial group in some circles, right? And yet, you kind of think, when you actually look at what we're doing there, which is trying to understand what are the specific kind of gender-driven obstacles to women entrepreneurs, women in their businesses, and women workers in the global economy, kind of, why would you not want to be trying to understand what those obstacles are and how, through trade policies and other policies, you can seek to remove those obstacles and enable the fuller participation of women in the workforce and ensure that women in their businesses are able to trade globally and grow those businesses to the enrichment of their communities. All that said, I think kind of coming back to where you started, Tatjana, so much as it is a good thing that we're having that broader discussion, this is a remarkably siloed panel. It is striking how often those discussions occur, whether that is frankly the WTO discussing nature or climate, or as it's going to do next month, AI, without always recognising the debates that are going on a mere couple of 100 meters away in some other organisation. And I find that, to be honest, there's a responsibility there. I think, first of all, we say it's a member-driven organisation. This is a member-driven city, right? And so the first obligation is upon ourselves. And I'll give you a very kind of, mea culpa, I'll give you a very practical example of that. We ran an initiative in the Human Rights Council on women's economic empowerment with Dominican Republic and Kyrgyzstan and others. I have to say to my own team, as they kind of merrily were drafting a joint statement for the Human Rights Council. By the way, we have actually been looking at a number of these issues in the WTO. So before we go rushing off describing different avenues for the Human Rights Council, can we just have a think about what we know already about one of the obstacles and identify where it is that Human Rights Council can have a particular role to play in advocacy on these issues. So first and foremost, I think it is incumbent on us, member states, to act in a more joined up way within our own teams and our own missions. But I think, to be honest, there is a piece here that I think is striking for me, coming to Geneva after sort of kind of multilateral experiences in both Brussels and New York, where I think the mechanisms for coordination amongst the different players are stronger in those cities than they are here. And there's remarkably little joining up between the international organizations. And I just give very practical example of that. We did a kind of the enabling force of diplomacy in Geneva. We did a dinner just the other week on exactly food diplomacy. And we brought together the different players on climate and nature across Geneva, right? Whether that be those who are engaged in these debates within WTO, the head of the World Meteorological Organization, the head of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, who is the kind of the lead on kind of green issues in the humanitarian space, NGOs active in this area. And what was striking to me was how few of them knew each other. How few of them had ever spoken to each other about these issues. And so a little bit of food, and actually also a game of conkers for the start, was enabled a bit of a discussion amongst them about how we could actually work together more effectively, because I think we shared common objectives, but we were pursuing quite distinct paths.
No, thank you so much, Simon. I love the way how you connected the dots between different organizations. And I think there is the theme emerging that once we understand what the obstacles are, trade policy can be used in a positive way. And I know Brazil has recently tabled a proposal on sustainable agriculture where you suggest that it should be seen in a positive way, how trade can be a force for good, and that it's also incumbent upon members maybe to try and connect the dots like other cities are doing, whether it's Brussels or whether it's New York. And I don't know if John Weeks is on. John once told me the story of when he was ambassador to Canada and when Canada was building its new mission that encompasses both the mission to the UN and to the WTO. I think there was a conscious effort to only have one bathroom for the ambassadors so that they at least meet a couple of times a day for a couple of seconds. Exchange views in the corridor.
Okay.
In the corridor. And John is on, I'll ask him to explain.
I'm not sure that's an idea that's going to catch on in the future. But I'll mention
It must be in the best of circumstances.
We'll ask John if it worked, the idea. Ambassador Pitfield, you have the floor to give us your perspectives.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be at FMG again. And today I'm very intimidated because of this senior, not by age but experience. And on this important issue, I think since we have already heard a background, I want to go into more practical details that I have experienced. I'm a negotiator that grew up with WTO rules. I was here. I was at the launch of the Doha round, but I have to say I cut my teeth in FTA negotiations. So, but I always tell my colleagues that WTO rules are the mother of all trade. If you are going to negotiate FTA, you have to know what you have already at the WTO. So you cannot just go straight and thinking of agriculture as only tariff reduction, because that's not all it takes in agriculture. So I'm very happy to be back as ambassador. This is my personal request that I do it here because I still believe in the usefulness and vitality, not vitality, the essence and why we need the multilateral rules, especially in certain areas. Having said that, I'm here second time 3.5 years, and like Ambassador Guilherme said, I have been quite well, he's not disappointed, but I have been a little bit, but I'm not surprised that things are not moving very quickly here. And what saddens me is that the WTO of my days in, when we were launching the Doha round, there were cars parked on both sides of the street. We had to walk afar just to go to the meeting. Parking was always full. Everybody was very alert and active there, but those days are, I would say, are gone forever, but it's not here for the moment, and it's really it has made me ask myself what happened, and I think one reason that I can see is that we are. I'm not speaking as Thai ambassador. We are probably living in too much WTO bubble, not even Geneva bubble. So it's the same. We are talking about the things, and we are not following, or we are not allowing the perspective of outsiders coming too much. When I was here, I was a services negotiator. We had constant contact with the private sector. We did not. So I think that one first thing that I would like to say is that we are missing out with the users of our rules, the private sectors. I don't think we have to bring them into the negotiation, but we must bring their perspective into the negotiations. And this is the first thing that I think is missing. And also is that because of the many veto or blocking here and there, WTO rules currently are not as modern. We are so slow behind the world. So, it's not modern enough. So with these two things, I look at question that Tatjana sent and how to connect the dots. My first question was, so what dots do we need to should be done? Okay, and you raised the matter of trade-related issues. I would like to propose, at least from my view, 4 areas that the dots should be joined. These are, of course, climate change, sustainability issue, the digital economy and services, public health, and development. And of course, there are things on important issue on agriculture and food, but maybe I will not give that as examples. But I think the way I see it, the dots that have to be joined are not only between WTO and outside, but within the WTO as well. I think this is very important, especially in the area of development. I think there are quite a lot of work and discussion in the WTO itself related to development, but they are silo within as well as silo without. So my first proposal for this is that we have to look at the dots within the WTO on certain issues, and but not only with the outside or outside WTO. Let's say then who should be involved with this connecting the dots? Of course, we think first of all the international organizations, but I think we also should bring in a perspective from private sector, from the civil society or NGO, as well as the academics. And the international organization, of course, there are many, and Madam Jaya already mentioned, and everybody knows the Whiteboard, WHO, ITC, ANCTAD, FAO, World Bank, WEF, and OECD, just to name a few. And then, so how? This is my last point. When I was chairing the TRIPS Council the last year, sorry, but I did just what you said. I did not have much. I have some background on TRIPS, but not so much. I know services and investment person, so I focused on my duty as a chair, because I know that that year the TRIPS waiver was the important thing. So I focus on public health issue. And I think that there are several things that WTO negotiators, as well as those involved in some of the issues I mentioned, we can do. But I think there are dots that have different natures, Tatjana. There are dots that are related to regulatory, dots on policy discussion or data and projects. So regulation, policy, data, and projects, these are the issues that we could work on in designing how we're going to go forward. Like a data sharing platform. I saw when I was TRIPS chair that when we brought in some outside information data, it had some impact on the dynamic of the discussion. So, and also this is happening in climate change and digital economy, you know, where data is very important. I think WTO, as well as other international organizations and private sector or academic and civil society, can think of how to design the data sharing platform or something, annual event, you know, focusing on data, who's working on what, and what kind of progress they have and what kind of emphasis they are doing. Second thing is I learned from the trilateral of the public health, the WTO, WHO, and WIPO, that actually those who are in the same issue, if they can sit down and coordinate at the top level of the DG and also technical level, then maybe we can create a better understanding among the negotiators. Like the WTO secretariat, they go to briefing for at WIPO delegate every few months. You know, I used to listen to that. So sometimes they also invite negotiators and vice versa. I think that this kind of collaboration can be very useful. Another thing is that we can do like a co-research or co-publication among relevant institutions, as well as the private sector. I think the academic, we should talk about this. And on how to bring in perspective of private sector, I think of what I do in Thailand before I came. Like I said, I do not foresee actual participation in the negotiation, but we can do things like foresight exercise. We should bring the WTO negotiators up to speed with the outside world and have a private sector and other people discuss and you know, what the world are moving. I know that they have we have a public forum, but the public forum focus on specific topic. What I see is like you invite very high-ranking private sector or something to give the direction of this is where the world is moving, or even geopolitics that Ambassador Guilherme talk about. So kind of get the forwardness. I'm finishing soon, and also technical input. We need this, especially climate change discussion, policy panel discussion, project coordination. This is very vital for development discussion, like ITC, ACTAD, EIF, for trade, and this can fit in the discussion on development. And lastly, I want to mention about the coordinating the negotiation forum that all three of you have mentioned. I think I share that there are like forum shopping. You know, even in Geneva, not only in capital, but what I saw is that sometimes like the TRIPS council, people said, oh, don't talk about this, talking about it in WIPO. At WIPO, they said they are talking about this at the WTO. So it ends up that this is some of the issues were not discussed, and I'm sure this was for the benefit of some members. But how do we avoid this? For this forum shopping or forum avoidance, I don't know, but it is very, very important. I don't know whether they did that by design or just it just happened, but So these are what I have at the moment. Thank you so much.
No, that was incredibly helpful. I particularly, you hit the nail on the head when you said, you know, it's no longer a question sometimes of forum shopping, but maybe also of forum avoidance. And you just push the button down the road.
Negotiating tax.
Like GI is not raised anywhere.
And maybe to summarize what I'm hearing, because I see some themes that are evolving, and then I'd like to give everybody the floor again for some remarks, or if you'd like to comment on anything, and your 1 to 3 main takeaways or recommendations. So I'm hearing, first of all, that there are silos, that we could do a better job at connecting the dots. We've heard a lot about what those dots could be. What are some of the areas, whether it's climate change or digital, public health or agriculture and food. But that's not only a question between connecting the dots between different international organizations, but also within one organization, for example, the WTO, that of course is tasked with a very broad range of trade-related issues. And we've also heard that it's incumbent, of course, upon member states to sometimes gently nudge or push to connect the dots on new issues or even with different international fora, like you mentioned, Simon, when you had a dinner, and of course, food always draws people. And just to introduce people who are dealing with the same issues, negotiators, secretariat officials, but who may not even have met, although they live in the same town. And you've also rightly said, if Brussels and New York can do it and can do a better job at connecting different dots or issues, so can Geneva definitely. And I'd like to give the floor to you for either remarks or comments on others, presentations, interventions, and also if you have any 1 to 3 takeaways, recommendations on what can be done to connect the dots, whether it's amongst delegations or within your delegation or within the WTO or amongst different international organizations. But general, how can we help connect the dots? I will start with, I'll mix things up a bit. I start with Jayashree because I know you have your 3 takeaways prepared.
Actually, I don't. I have one takeaway, but now, now that I've heard everyone, I think everyone really brought in a lot of different perspectives and I mean, I want to address this within an organization coordination, because I worked in the WTO Secretariat for almost 2 decades. And I know that in recent years, there have been attempts made to break down the silos within the WTO Secretariat divisions, So there's a trade and health group, for instance, that meets, quite regularly, updates each other on the work that each division is following on trade and health, that kind of thing. And Madam Ambassador talked about the trilateral cooperation. That's really essentially cooperation among the secretariats, and it has been useful. It hasn't broken down all silos, and it's not perfect, but it is a step in the right direction, in terms of at least 3 organizations, the WHO, WIPO, and the WTO, talking only on one subject, which is the connection between IP and health. So, and trade and health more broadly, but IP has been always the focus of that. Now, coming to the role of member states, where I think, to put the onus on my 3 co-panelists, I think member states really have a lot to do with this. In my view, governments work in silos themselves, in ministries and the capitals. There are silos, and those silos have to be broken down in the capitals. The same silos operate in Geneva, particularly where, not like the UK and Brazil, but perhaps maybe in Thailand, I'm not very sure. The missions are different. The mission, the permanent mission to the UN, the permanent mission to the WTO, and so on. So they don't talk to each other. I know about India. Yeah, there's quite little interaction between the 2. even if there are common subjects like health or intellectual property between, so those silos need to be broken down. But I will end with what is the role for secretariats, because I think, you do have experts in Geneva. I don't know how it happens in Brussels and in New York, where there has been some degree of success in breaking down silos. But I think the secretariats can play a big role in briefings and debriefings and, kind of letting everyone in on what's going on in different forums. Now, with the internet, it's not like the old days where information was like everything and you could keep information to yourself and then have these turf battles. Now, practically everybody knows what's going on. They may not understand the nuances of what's going on. So if these briefings can be done by secretariat officials to each other's, to negotiators in different forums, that might help. And I think training is another good way to go forward. You don't need to become an expert, but you do need to understand some of the nuances. And you need a forum where you can ask questions and get your doubts clarified, that kind of thing. I think secretariats could play a big role in this. So the initiative in the end is with the member states. Yeah.
I want to share how I work with the UN, which luckily I have been on good terms with all my UN ambassadors colleagues. So what we do is we know that there are some issues that are overlapping, like digital economy in ITED and health in the pandemic treaty. So I invite I asked the ambassador, could you please send your colleagues who negotiate the WTO, IHO to tell me what's going on, and we exchange views. So but we haven't done this like regular basis, maybe on demand, but so far we are okay. We take note of what is going on. Yeah, and we also lucky in the sense that we have ASEAN coordination. ASEAN and WTO, we do not negotiate as one, but and in Geneva we have a working ASEAN. ASEAN meets every month, so we know who's doing what, and we can share or we can request for information from the coordinator. So I think that's one thing which is good, but I understand that it's not always we don't get access informed all the time, but we at least we can try to make it in.
Well, we're already on you, Ambassador Pitfield. Any additional takeaways? You said, what you personally are doing to make sure you coordinate with your UN ambassador and how regional groupings meet, and that also helps to connect the dots and break down silos. Any other recommendations?
For me, my experience is that we should also connect the dots within our capital. I think it is important. Increasingly, our capital is, I would say, lose interest in us, but it's like Geneva is so far away from their mind. I don't, maybe not for Brazil, who are very strong supporter of multilateralism, but in Asia, many countries are very fixated on FTA negotiation because it is easier to explain to the public. It is easier to explain to the private sector, and the issues are not as complicated. I dread every time I think I may have to explain about agriculture negotiation to my minister or even to my permanent secretary because of the sheer complexity of the issue. And okay, this is not our fault, but I think that we should find a way to I don't know, don't forget inputs and people who are main players from capital. This is especially true for future discussion on climate change. Climate change is another very silo issue. Capital like me and the environment ministry, we talk, but we don't share everything at the same time. And in the future, this is going to be one of the most complicated negotiations. So I don't have solution for that. We have another very bureaucratic structure in capital, but I think for the future issue, we need to take into account how to involve capital.
Thank you so much. I go zigzag. I go to Ambassador Patriota next, if I may.
Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed it, and everybody's looking perspectives and different approaches. I think they show different dimensions, I think, to speak on. Well, two considerations, and not takeaways, but just reflections. One is the difference between New York, Brussels, Geneva. I think New York, Brussels, perhaps it's a single jurisdiction, whereas in Geneva you have multiple jurisdictions. So that is quite challenging. And then the way in which issues are discussed, they're more technical in nature. And you have agencies that are autonomous or independent within the UN system. They're not in New York, everything communicates. You're all dealing with a subject area under one of the committees of the General Assembly, and the ambassadors are responsible for the whole thing. And you deal in one issue against another issue. So sometimes a human rights issue, you will need the support of other members to put forward your position. And then next, in an issue on trade or development, in ECOSOC or something, you need another coalition to support you. So it's part of the whole thing. People talk to each other and issues crisscross. But the level of discussion doesn't go as deep as in Geneva. So this is why the siloing happens here more than elsewhere. It is a challenge. But the interface between these institutions, in a way, this interface is mediated by member states. And usually the stronger member states have greater influence in this mediation, what permeates and what doesn't from one institution to the other. So, for example, I worked with WHO for during the Zika pandemic. It was pre-COVID times, and there's always discussion. There's always a latent interest from developing countries to bring the IP discussion into the WHO. Okay, developed countries and their pharmaceutical industries fight this off. They don't allow it. They don't wish to have a real discussion on IP that has an overriding concern with actual public health dimensions. They prefer to have this discussion under other bodies that do not have the public health dimensions as their priority, but they have either the trade concerns or the property concerns of IP holders as their major problem. So that's why you have the separation, and it's difficult to talk to each other. So they're shielded from coordinating with each other. I know many instances in the past where secretariat members, the technical staff of WTO was not really encouraged to interact with secretariat staff members from WHO or to provide them any real concrete support for coordination. The trilateral coordination between WTO, WHO, and WIPO is very superficial. It's very sort of ceremonial. They join and have these nice conversations. The heads show up and talk about the world, but there's no real interaction on any particular negotiating level. So that's one of the concerns. It doesn't happen haphazardly. This is manufactured by those who have greater clout and control over who does what and where. In the WTO, for instance, we're dealing with fisheries, which is now considered the possible #1 deliverable is fisheries subsidies agreement #2, which is the most important of them. And this is working on a mandate that derives from the SDGs negotiations in New York under the UN. It's a development-oriented discussion. Sustainable development oriented. It stems from the Rio +20 process and all that. And here we are at the WTO working and negotiating on a treaty based on a mandate, which is 14.6 from the SDG 14.6. So when there is an agreement and the will, you can absorb mandates even from outside the WTO and actually bring them in and work on them. Now, WTO, what kind of environmental expertise or fisheries expertise it has? Not much, but you can always bring things from FAO and from other bodies. The membership does that. And then the Secretariat has to also research and improve their capacity to support this, and they usually can respond. So it's not impossible. When there's a will, there's a way. It's just, an issue of consensus building and agreements in that direction. And I can just list you a whole series of the new discussion items that will be pushing WTO in a beyond trade only direction. So you have, many countries, developed countries, usually wanting to discuss industrial policy / subsidies. It has to do with green transitions, energy transitions, so on and so forth. Developing countries want to discuss policy space for development. There was 9 papers from the Africa group on this, and they want to put this forward. Brazil and others wish to discuss sustainable agriculture, which is different from agricultural reform. So this is trying to factor in the sustainability dimension into agriculture, and it's a forward-looking discussion. Then you have the digital economy. The expression of digital economy so far has been a discussion on e-commerce, but this can extrapolate, I think, as we progress. Now we're actually stuck on the permanent moratorium or no moratorium, so on and so forth. In the IP, we had some pressure to expand IP because of the COVID. So that was a health concern. It was not a trade concern. So because of health concerns globally, there was the waiver for vaccines and then an attempt to extend that to medicines and diagnostics. But when the COVID epidemic subsided, then the political pressure for this to move forward also subsided, and we didn't manage to. You have food security, you have plastics, you have trade and environment discussions, the CTE, you have women and small and medium and micro enterprises, the inclusion that's being brought in by Australia and others very strongly, which is not just gender, it's beyond gender, but it's a human sort of kind of human related, not exclusively trade related, not purely trade related. So all these things are pressures that attempt to move the WTO and expand its role beyond purely trade, the typical, GATT-based trade kind of negotiations. And we have, I think, to rise to the challenge.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Last but not least, Ambassador Manley.
Well, thank you very much. Quite hard after everybody else has offered some wise thought. I was going to just pick up on I was going to take a more optimistic take on the sort of discussion around some health and IP. Actually, I'm going to pay tribute to Guilherme's UN colleague, who's playing a leading role on the Pan-American Accord negotiations. And actually, I do think we're having under his sort of coordination a really important discussion actually about how you share the kind of not the intellectual property itself, but how you best prepare for pandemics by the commitments you get from pharmaceutical companies to share their vaccines and their therapeutics and diagnostics in these circumstances. That's clearly on the back of the experience of COVID. That's a really important discussion to be had. I would say where I very much agree is that the coordination between WIPO, WTO, and WHO is too top down, it's too formal, it's too ceremonial, and actually where we'd have benefited in those negotiations would have been from more real expertise. Let's go back to your point. More expertise from the kind of the technical experts within WIPO, within WTO, who could have better informed and steered that conversation. And I think that's, if I may say this, it's going to lead across to a really good point that the Ambassador Thailand was making about the kind of the bubble, right? And WTO is a bit of a bubble, but so are many of these other organisations. We're all of us, all these organisations, and actually probably even as beyond sort of member states of them, quite poor at engaging with the wider world, and quite poor at engaging with business in particular. We have this kind of marvelous public forum, which is fantastic, but it's for a week. It's a bit like kind of buying a puppy for Christmas. It'd be great to have it for the other 51 weeks of the year as well, right? So we do need to get better with that. And I think particularly because you're right. We're not particularly good at using the data that's out there. Some of which is in the Secretariat. It's there if you could just pull it out and use it more effectively. My new trade minister, you might imagine the background to this comment, that he said in an interview recently that he wanted a trade policy that was driven by data, not delusions. But I think that is a data-driven trade policy, it would be a good thing, but as would be a data-driven health policy and a data-driven IT policy in this town. So I think, you know, we do need to find better ways to engage with the wider world. And that, you say that may not be the business being in the negotiation, but it is about finding the vehicles through which you can learn from what's being done outside, so that the rules that you are developing are rules that can be applied in the real world.
Thank you so much. I do a bit of musical chairs. I just go over there, I mute us, and then I see if there are any questions from
There are
the
some
audience.
questions I saw.
Oh, they are in the chat. There probably are some chat.
I might need technical assistance for answering.
Yeah, they're just.
Or maybe we can ask
Very small.
Okay.
Wait, let me go so I can
Peter,
read it out.
Yeah, Tatjana, I think we got two questions from our members, Ignacio and Clem. So I would simply suggest that Natalie give them floor so they could raise the question and then the panel can discuss. Is that okay for you?
Absolutely.
Okay, Natalie, if Ignacio and Clem are still around, would you give them floor so they could raise directly their questions and comments? Yeah.
I have given course.
Okay.
I think they can just unmute themselves now.
Okay.
Well, hello. I mean, I think to a certain extent, my question has been answered by many of the discussions, but I wonder where any of you could give a little bit more of an indication about how you think it would be the better way to move forward on discussions on the trade and climate. Because my impression is that if you want to have a meaningful discussion about trade and climate, you really need to bring in the different types of expertise. I mean, you need to talk about trade instruments, you need to talk about climate environmental instruments, you need to talk about issues relating to finance, and it's very difficult to find a place where you can have discussions that bring all of those issues together, because before you decide whether you want to negotiate about anything, you need to understand the different dimensions of a topic. So do you have any sense about what would be the better way to have meaningful conversations on the different dimensions of trade and climate? I mean, to give you an example, I mean, it's clear, for instance, that Dr. Negosi has a lot of interest in having discussions about carbon pricing, but carbon pricing is a topic on which there's limited expertise in the WTO. How can you have a meaningful conversation about carbon pricing that brings in the right expertise?
Who would like to go first? Ambassador Patriota, would you like to go first?
I think that's a very good and a very difficult question. First of all, I, as Brazil, would probably prefer to tackle the trade and environment question, not through the climate lens. So not through the climate change lens, but through other kinds of lens. So I wouldn't start on the basis of emissions or carbon pricing mechanisms. But in a way, on the other hand, we're kind of forced to deal with that because of certain measures being adopted by the EU that Ignacio knows very well. That forces us in a way to react because of the trade implications and consequences of that, not because of the climate consistency of the measure itself so I think it's a difficult question. I think the DG responded when she was pressured by trying to outsource a study on carbon pricing mechanism. This was met with mixed reactions, I think, from the membership. I wasn't here yet, but I heard. And so it's an open question. If members agree, the organization, I think, could improve on the capacity to support such a discussion. But I'm not sure there would be consensus on this right now.
It's nice to hear from Ignacio. Second, I mean, I think the problem is there isn't a perfect forum. There isn't as you first suggested, there isn't a currently existing organization or occasion, even the COP itself, that provides a perfect kind of storm of expertise and mandate, right? So I think to some extent, this is up for grabs, and I think you could have. Yeah, I can actually see the WTO being at least the kind of the physical place where you might have a discussion, say, about methodologies on carbon pricing. And then, obviously, individual members would need to bring their own expertise to that, and it would need to be a genuine, not like the kind of the trilateral on health, but it would need to be a genuinely kind of inter-organizational effort in which you are bringing in the expertise of whether it be the OECD or whoever, to have an informed discussion on that, and in which you were listening to business, because actually that's where it seems to me the real problem lies when you talk to multinational businesses who are struggling to work out how on earth you run your operations when each jurisdiction appears to be coming up with a different solution.
And I think there was a question from Clem.
I think Clem has a question, and then Alan and also Peter has a comment. So probably we can start with Clem first, and then see Peter or Alan whether they want to take the floor. Clem, are you around?
Yeah, I'm around. And my question is perhaps a naughty one. The assumption is that it is a good idea, a good thing to join the dots. And my question is it? It's a devil's advocate's question, but when we concern ourselves with joining the dots, we spend a lot of time on issues like trade and gender, trade and health, trade and in the environment, etc. And we detract from the very real need to strengthen what is at the moment a very fragile trading system. Whereas if we work hard to strengthen fundamentally at strengthening the trading system, we free resources in an efficient system for a country to deal directly with, for example, an environmental matter, rather than have this matter become enmeshed in trade issues, and in so doing, perhaps become a reason, an excuse for protectionism. It's a naughty question I'm asking, but should we not spend more of our time devoted to simply strengthening a system that we have and which is in some danger? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Clem. Tatjana, because Alan has to leave in a few minutes for another meeting, so we may allow him to post his comments or questions, and then we can answer the two together, probably. Yeah.
Thank you very
Alan.
much.
Yeah, please.
Question for is first of all, thank you for this very rich discussion, which has been very informative and helpful. A lot is done on an ad hoc basis, and a question is whether there's some institutionalization that would help. Whether it would or not is an open question. Perhaps a council among the international organizations at the deputy director general level, where they would be in charge of outreach and coordination. We did this on an ad hoc basis. I called the director general of the ILO to secretary general to get some joint research going, but we didn't have a constant interchange. So institutionally, is it worth doing something formally? And secondly, use of data. E-ping in the TBT, in the standards area, is very useful in informing anyone who has an interest, including the public or the private sector, in a standards area, to automatically notify them of what's going on. So if you had trade and gender or trade and health or trade and climate, and you had an e-ping kind of system where everyone is notified instantly of proposals, perhaps that would help with the spread of information and potential coordination. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and also we have a comment from Peter. Yeah, Peter is in the panel. Peter, you want to take the floor?
Thanks, Lou. I do have a question, but maybe I'll wait for the answers to those two first.
Okay, yeah. So Tatjana, you can go ahead now with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There were two questions on whether collaboration should be more institutionalized from Alan, and then a, in quote, naughty one from Clem as to whether there should not be more focus on the WTO's core functions before we address newer challenges such as environmental climate change. Who would like to take either both or comments? Jayashree.
Yeah. To Clem's provocative question. You know, unfortunately, we don't have the choice. I don't think today you have the choice of saying, let's just focus on the core issues and let's get our house in order, because, you know, things are moving in other forums. So you don't have them. You have to deal with all the other issues as they are happening. The pandemic, climate change, those issues are not going to wait. So I don't think we have that luxury, okay? I want to also address Alan's question. Now, at the DG level, in the all intergovernmental organizations, they meet under the chairmanship of the Secretary General and so on. But that's a very, very broad, and I don't know what they do then. And whether anything gets coordinated, but there is that forum. The council, you know, kind of idea at a Geneva level, IGOs, a meeting at the DDG level, that makes sense. It makes sense. You need some kind of mechanism, but the e-ping thing where everyone gets notified, you know, simultaneously of the proposals that are happening, that's not going to work, because, you know, negotiations are happening in silos, and negotiations are secret a lot of times. They are not put on the web immediately. You have to wait at least a month or so to get the draft. For instance, the pandemic latest draft will come after some time, but there'll be some months in between where there are many drafts which you won't see, and you won't even know what member is saying what, unless you're like Tatjana and you're in the room. You see, and that no organization is going to allow another organization to get in on those at that informal level. WTO would not allow it at the informal negotiations, and I don't think others would also. But the council is a good idea. We don't know how helpful that would be. I don't know. Yeah, my thoughts, please.
Any other comments? I know we're coming up on time. Any more comments from here from my panelists? Ambassador Patriota.
I have two comments along the lines of Jayashree. I think strengthening the system we have would be my preferred choice, but it's not enough. It will not do. I think the demands coming from the outside go in different directions. I think the creators of the system are no longer satisfied with what we currently have. It will not do for them. Well, this is a bit of a lost cause. It's crying over spilled milk. This is the past. The system we have is no longer in the interest of those who created it. So either we modify the system or we shut down the system. I think it's a lost cause. Myself, you know, it's different when you try to generate momentum to deepen the agreement on agriculture according to its Article 20, and you find such resistance and difficulty in finding agreement. On the other hand, you're raising discussion on sustainable agriculture. You get a lot of support, a lot of interest, including from outside of the WTO. A lot of stakeholders want to discuss sustainability. So if you just want to discuss agriculture from a purely trade distorting point of view, you're going to get nowhere. If you add up sustainability concerns and other related issues, a lot of people will show up and you get some momentum. So that's the reality to deal with. And again, the issue of coordination, I have just one example. I've been dealing with ages in the TRIPS Council. The TRIPS Council does have a mandate related to the environment, which is the mutual supportiveness between MEAs and the trade agreements, right?
Yes.
And we have an MEA, which is the Convention on Biodiversity, and we've been for ages trying to get a member of the CBD to participate in a TRIPS Council meeting. And guess what? The European Union will never accept it.
Nor the
It has
US, it's
not-
the US.
Nor the US for over 20 years, 30 years.
Yeah.
That's the level of things you have to deal with. And you're talking about coordination among the secretariat? How? Question.
I just want to address about whether we should deal with core business before others. I say, okay, that would be ideal, but the core business are not moving. If we focus on trying to get dispute settlement reform or agriculture or even some other issues, then there's nothing much to do. But I think that I may be looking at a different perspective, a little bit from Mr. Bunnekamp. I know what he's asking. I think that so many things are trade related now, and WTO cannot stand and doing nothing. Okay, we are not going to take over the job of discussing the carbon credit, for example, because that's not what we know. But like for me, my job is to understand the trade implications of what the system that EU or or the multilateral mechanism from UNFCCC are going to have impact on trade, and that is my job. Okay, unfortunately, as of now, there's nothing much we can do in terms of responding to these non-trade issues, even though they have trade implications. But I would say that we cannot stand and doing nothing. At least we have to discuss and we have to try to see it from the trade perspective, because this eventually will affect our entrepreneurs and even the government measures.
Any final words from here, unless there's any more questions? I know we're coming up on time. It's been, at least for me, an incredibly rich discussion, and I hope you found it equally helpful and enriching. And maybe the sparks of some sort of process of collaboration, who knows, in Geneva.
Yeah, Tatjana, I just want to know whether the panel can allow a few more minutes, because we do have a comment from Peter, and also I myself have 2 quick comments. So I think it will be good if we can pose them and then have a few more minutes, if that's okay for you. So I think I see a yes. So
Yes.
Peter, okay. Peter, why don't you go ahead and I'll follow up? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Rather like Clem, my question is a bit naughty, but it is also serious. I've been following a lot of what's been happening in the WTO. I mean, I used to work in the Secretariat, but this year, from the ministerial to the public forum to the kind of discussion we've had this today, there's been a lot about talk about what the WTO should discuss. But it seems to me that the WTO's main role, I mean, discussion is part of it, but that's not the main role. The main role is decision making, because people who can discuss and advise are there are lots. That you've got UNCTAD, you've got OECD, you've got all various other people. And the question that I have is actually that because decision making is held up, mainly because of problems with consensus, but also with problems with ratification. Fish 1 is not even enforced anywhere in the world, and nowhere near being enforced anywhere in the world at the moment, the 2022 fish agreement, and all the other stuff is stuck. How on earth is it going to be valuable to talk about all of this stuff in an organization like the WTO if the WTO is going to be the WTO members are going to be unable to take decisions on them, to have consensus or whatever decision making that actually makes it a decision?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I also have 2 quick comments. I think as we are discussing now, actually those dots are already connected one way or the other. As we're saying that other organizations are discussing many issues on pandemic and on environment, which has a substantial part on trade aspect. And also we do see a lot of RTAs like CPTPP, RCEP, and others who already are connecting trade with labor, environment, state-owned enterprise, and so on and so forth. The only problem, as Peter is saying, that it's not happening in the WTO. For some issues, of course, WTO does have the mechanism to provide a meaningful discussion. Let's say if agriculture is related to environment and others, we could either do it on the Agriculture Committee or the CT, be it regular or special. But the problem, there are also issues where you don't have a mechanism, let's say a labor, or as we are discussing, the geopolitical related national security with some unilateral or trade cohesive measures, which also needs to be discussed. And our members, Petros and Andrew Sabir, have proposed to have a kind of committee on national security. So those are things we need to reflect upon. The second thing, I want to pick up what Nam has said about the developmental aspect. The first thing is that how do we bring developing countries on board? So development is not only a horizontal issue, but also a specific issue in each and every discussion that we are trying to do by joining the doors. I mean, you see what various GSIs, the plurilateral initiatives, you already see that some are doing extremely well with developing countries on board, such as the investment facilitation for development, but you do see other GSIs which have little, if not none, LDC or developed country participation. So I do think that it will be important to see how we can factor development into future initiatives, and then by joining those, that we make sure that we have developing countries on board, and so as they will be a positive contributor to our future events, discussions. I will just stop here and give you back the floor, Tatjana. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Who would like to take the either question or both?
I'm not sure I'll pick up, but both. Can I just say, I mean, I remain an optimist. And I think optimism is quite important in multilateralism. And I remain an optimist because, for three reasons. First of all, it is only a couple of years since we actually did agree Fisheries 1, right? And everyone told you that wasn't possible. I'm not optimist second because this gentleman opposite me managed to negotiate a multilateral agreement in WIPO earlier this year, which shows that it's absolutely possible to do multilateralism in 2024. And I'm an optimist three because actually we became remarkably close to agreement in Abu Dhabi on Fisheries 2, on investment facilitation with development. We are, after all, talking about, in most cases, one or two delegations who have issues with these agreements. And that you have to believe that these are resolvable issues. It's not beyond the wit of negotiators to find a way through. So, and I'm not just one last point. We talked about the WTO being, it's about decisions. WTO is also, it's an extraordinary body of rules. So my trade minister coming here for his first visit on Monday, the first thing I said to him was, you know, you asked me when you took on the job, is the WTO important for the delivery of our growth mission as a government? I said, absolutely, because I'm afraid our exporters are not going to be export our way to prosperity without the WTO rules that underpin that trade. So, you know, let's not forget what we have, as well as giving fresh energy to what we want to achieve.
Great. Good way to end on a positive.
It's always good to end on a positive note. We will hand it back to you, Lou. Also because our system seems to be shutting down and I'm not digitally advanced enough to prevent it from doing so. Yes, exactly. You need to press the button. Just press the button. I did.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Tatjana. I will be happy to take over. and also a million thanks to you and also all the panelists for this rich discussion. Of course, we have talked a lot, but also we have left quite some out because of lack of time, especially on some different issues, pandemic, environment, others. Probably in the future, we should do a little bit more reflection on how we can go deeper, into the discussion, and then try to propose even more tangible or targeting proposals. So I think that that will be the next steps, and we can always come together with Tatjana, Jayashree, and others, trying to find a way forward with more sessions like this on specific issues. So with that, I thank you all for being with us, and also thanks to our audience. The first time we have a webinar audience with us, for their patience staying with us all through this 1 and 45 minutes. So we look forward to welcome you next time for our FMG session. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.